Oh, Clark and Tio, Clark and Tio.
No.
They go together like a Miss and Cleo. Don't know much about 'em, but you can't do Pedanticast without 'em. How we doing, Mr. Clark?
Well, I am very tired, but I must ask, how long have you been preparing that one?
About an hour. A lot of syllables to work with, but yes, ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, and any children who happen to have found us, welcome to the Pedanticast. It's that time of week where we think about things that probably should not be thought about for a little too hard. Now, we have a very special subject this week. Clark, would you like to talk about what we are going to be talking about for the next hour or so?
Yes, well, in general, we're going to be talking about Married with Children, that great 80s sitcom, 80s to 90s sitcom, but more specifically, we're talking about Al Bundy and his effect on the sitcom genre and his many anomalies while within it.
Absolutely. And when it comes to Al Bundy, he is by far, I would say, one of the most popular sitcom characters possibly ever. If you ever have watched the show, especially recently, every time that he comes on screen, round of applause from the audience.
Oh yeah, they talked about. I remember watching this short documentary on it, and they would talk about how ridiculous it was. Every time he just walked through the door, the crowd would go crazy for him.
And when you think of this show, you think of him. And it
Yes,
really is about the family, and certainly you think about Bud or Peg or all. You think about all the characters, Marcy, and weirdly enough, Marcy's husband, who is played by Ted McGinley of Revenge of the Nerds. And getting off topic, but it really is Al Bundy's show, I think.
yeah, and like nothing to take away from like Katie Seagal's great performance or Christina Applegate and so on and so forth.
David
But
Faustino.
yes, yes, I was just blanking on his name. But Al Bundy, Ed O'Neill does such an amazing job. Just and we'll get to kind of explaining the idea of the show, but I just wanted to say I remember this one story of when they were doing the auditions for the show and they were doing it for Al Bundy's part. The story goes that Ed O'Neill got up and they started the audition, and what happened was he like look because it was placed in the shoe store. He looked up at the clock and it was quitting time, and he just gives this lugubrious sigh, and apparently the creator of the show says, cut, that's it, you've got the part.
And to his credit, I don't know if I can picture anyone else playing this role. Um,
No, not as well, not as I think. If anything, if anyone else had it, it would have been a less enjoyable role. It would have been less relatable in a way. It may be a little bit more mean spirited. I feel like Ed O'Neill really brings a likability to the character that would not exist otherwise.
so I feel like we should back up a bit though, and
Yes.
since it's a sitcom, obviously we aren't going to go over the entire plot, but I would like to kind of go over the premise for anyone who might not be familiar. Married with Children is a sitcom. It started in the late 80s and ran until the late 90s, about 10 years, I'm not sure how many seasons, but it's the story of the Bundy family. Al is the father of the family, and he is a high school quarterback turned women's shoe salesman. And it very much is representative of the, I would say, prototypical blue collar, middle class, lower middle class, that feeling of existential dread. It's very representative of this typical blue collar American lifestyle, but not shown in the typically positive way. One thing I
Right.
do notice about a lot of sitcoms of the time is that it does say, well, it kind of glorifies the blue collar lifestyle a bit.
Right,
It,
absolutely. Well, and to really give context, the sitcoms before this were usually either like very, I don't want to say very happy families, but they usually are very well-to-do, fairly. well adapted, or I'm spacing out on the exact words I want to use, but they well adjusted. There we go. Families that get that even though they have those fights, they still get along. The first thing that always comes to mind, even though it's a good ways back in comparison to that time period, but the Brady Bunch, like they were
That
the
that is, I would say, the prototypical sitcom idea is
yeah,
the family who has some kind of problem. Not, I
right,
don't mean like the family has a problem. Like there's a problem in the episode that the family solves by the end of it. Another example, although it's not based on a family, might be Happy Days.
right.
Um, Alf, if you want to get weird. Mork and Mindy. All in the Family, actually, I think is probably the closest comparison I could think of. But with that said, I think Married with Children does separate itself.
Well, yeah, but well, actually, that's a funny thing because I will be getting. I want to talk about All in the Family. No, yeah, All in the Family, and because I do have an interesting comparison to make there, but we'll get to that point.
Right.
But yes, the context there is that when Married with Children kind of came out, it was very different in the sense that you got this dysfunctional family that fought all the time. They were lower class. They
And
argued and
absolutely, not to cut you off, but I think one of the
right.
key
That's fine.
differences that you're kind of getting at is the tone. When I think of the sitcom in general, I think of the word optimistic. All the problems can be solved in half an hour. The characters, even when they have problems, they're not going to lose the house. They're not going to it's going to be something that is solvable in most cases unless it's a very special episode, which are very rare. Most of the episodes are, oh, I need to study hard for my test, but the neighbor is mowing the lawn, and how can I get him to stop?
Right. At worst, it's like some kind of tiki curse, right?
Right, and Married with Children really does have a pessimistic attitude towards life in general. The idea behind the Bundys is that their life is terrible. They eat poor food. Peg sits at home all day and does nothing while Al works in this job that he hates. There's these big fat women who always come and insult him at his job. It's all very much meant to be a pessimistic, cutting, almost mockery of American life at the time. And it's interesting that it takes that tact because you normally, again, see a more optimistic viewpoint. Like, oh, the family loves each other. In this one, I'm not sure. Like, Al will go and beat up a boyfriend if he makes Kelly cry. But
Right.
their family is constantly sniping at each other. They're constantly complaining at each other. They're constantly cutting each other down. They don't like their house. They don't like their lives. It's all
Right.
incredibly negative.
Right. And before we get into Al Bundy specifically, I wanted to ask, what's your general feeling about the show? What's your thoughts and opinions on it?
So I discovered the show actually a little later because given the time frame that it ran in, I would have been about 7 or so whenever it was on TV.
Right.
So I actually came back and rediscovered it later, and I ended up watching like a whole back catalog. I watched like 4 or 5 seasons worth, like
Nice.
over the course of about a year. But plus, there's compilations and parts. But when I think of this show, what I really, really do think of is that it is incredibly quick, 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 snappy line, joke, joke, joke. It is, it's a very distinct and is very strong, but I think a lot of that is because of Al. Not to just keep coming back to him, but I really can't overstress how much the show basically is made by this one character. And when I think of the show, he's who I think of. I think of a show that's very funny, very well written, very negative, and yet it doesn't become. It's very intelligent about how it goes about it. Believe it, because, and I know it's almost thin ice to ever call something intelligent because I don't want to say like, oh, you don't get it, but With that
Right.
said, I do think the writing here is very is very good. I think it's probably some of the best writing I've seen on just about any sitcom I have seen because the dialogue especially is so good, is so funny.
Right, and I agree with you there, and I would say that even though it's negative, oddly enough, I don't think it ever really becomes mean-spirited. It never gets too pessimistic.
Or if
It's
it does, it's a worthy target.
Yeah, and but for the most part, I feel like there's always, even if it's the oddest places, and maybe there's a point to this in the show that even in the oddest places, you'll find a little bit of hope that you can get you through the rest of the day. Al will usually find something that makes all this nonsense he deals with a little bit more tolerable or something of the sort. So it kind of says that, if you're like kind of in this blue collar, lower class family, you usually find something, even if it's so absurd how
Well,
life is, you usually find something, even if it seems like insanely small. Not to say it's
no,
super
it doesn't.
optimistic.
And one, if there, and when I say it's negative, you're right. There is some level of optimism to it, but one thing that it stresses is that if I was to make a philosophy of the show, if you will, it's to find joy in those little things. Is to
Right.
find joy in being able to sit in front of the TV, put your hand in your pants, and then just lay there.
Right, absolutely. And so, yeah, me personally, I grew up with the show because my family was always enjoying it. We loved stuff like on the Family. We loved Roseanne. We love Married with Children. We love those kind of sitcoms that are a little bit dysfunctional or have that kind of rude quality humor
Mm-hmm.
while still being fairly smart. And so. Married with Children was just one of those shows that I did grow up with, and so I've kind of known it my whole life. And even though later seasons I didn't really keep up with the earlier half of the show, most of the
It got
show
a little
I
weird.
love. Yeah, I got a little weird towards the
I'm not
later
saying there
seasons.
were aliens, but I'm not saying there weren't.
um, but
Why is
with
it with
that,
sitcoms and aliens? Alf, Mork, this?
because I think it's a great representation of absurdity
Yeah.
in a way. But with that said, let's move on to the main topic we want to get to, and that is Al. And I think the question that we have about him is he the hero or is he the anti-hero?
Yes,
And
is
so,
he someone that should be admired, emulated, or glorified? Or is he someone who is meant to be seen as I guess, an example of. Is he someone to be imitated or someone to be pointed and laughed at?
right. And this is where my All in the Family comparison I wanted to bring in. And for those who don't know, All in the Family is kind of this odd show where you
Very,
have
very controversial in its time, to be fair to it.
yes, and to a point it's kind of interesting because it stars Carol O'Connor as Archie Bunker, and he plays this kind of conservative, old-timey kind of character, and he has his wife, Edith
And weirdly
Bunker.
enough, Rob Reiner's in it.
Yeah, Rob Reiner, kind of earlier in his career, playing Meathead for those who know, and his girlfriend,
Sally
Archie's.
Struthers, of all
Yeah,
people.
yeah, Archie Bunker's daughter, and they're kind of moved in, and but like Rob Reiner's character is supposed to be this kind of liberal, and they clash heads with Archie's character. But the whole idea is so the whole thing about All in the Family is that I think there's this duality of the audience where I think the show is meant to where you're supposed to point and laugh at Archie or his kind of old school conservative views and how he doesn't get things, quote unquote.
Mm-hmm.
But there is also an audience with that show where Archie is kind of not to say the hero, but he is the protagonist. He
Well,
is
they relate
overcoming.
to him.
Right. And so there's a point that I think it comes to the that even if the point of All in the Family is to laugh at Archie, that people kind of connect with Archie as well. And I feel it's the same with Al Bundy, where the show created is supposed to make fun of his mentality, his men are men and I am a part of the working class. They're supposed to laugh at his folly, but there's an audience that grew with this show that totally relate to him, that connect with him on a certain level. And so it kind of becomes a weird gray area like it does in All in the Family,
Well, and
where
not to jump ahead, but actually they did mention there had a reunion special where they talked about they would get letters from people talking about how it reminded them of their life growing up, and this would kind of horrify the actors because it was played up to be so over the top.
right.
And to be to be very clear here, Al Bundy, depending on the episode, it can be a cartoon character.
Yeah, yeah.
Subtlety is not the show's forte, but what it does do very well. And so, with Al Bundy, follow me down this rabbit hole. You have a character who is coming from this very celebrated past. He was the star quarterback of the football team in high school, and who has now fallen into. He gets Peg pregnant, they get married, and he gets a job at the shoe store. And then, basically, from that point, as far as we can tell, that's his life. He's now married with children. Get it? But the focus of it is that Al is constantly trying to find some kind of joy in his life. He's trying, and what's weird is he's not portrayed as a good person.
No,
He's
not at all.
selfish. He's boorish. He is rude. He makes fun of people constantly. He's short-tempered. He is just so self-interested. And yet at the same time, there's a lot of sympathy towards him because he is the only one taking care of the family. He's married to this woman, Peg. Again, great performance by Kitty Segal, but the point of the show is she sits at home literally eating bonbons. That's one of the running jokes in the show. And I do wonder if there's an audience, especially a male audience, who kind of relates to that idea, that feeling of being the one who is the only one taking care of a family, of having to be that provider, and basically feeling like that kind of sucks sometimes. There's a strange nobility in his life, even if that nobility is not present in the character. Even if that character has all those negative qualities I just mentioned, there's still a strange nobility to the fact that he does keep working this job he hates and spending all his money to take care of a family that doesn't appreciate him.
Well, there's a line, right? Like, with even though he is kind of all these things, he never crosses certain lines that would make him irredeemable. Like, there's always jokes of him like taking looks at other women because he's quote unquote stuck with Peggy. But it's like he never cheats or anything. He as much as he would want to, he doesn't, and he still, even though he complains about it all the time, and he would rather be doing anything else, he does his work. And even if he complains about his family, he still does the things for them. And so, to a point, even though he is these like mostly notably negative traits, people he's still redeemable, and so like you can feel sympathy for the devil in this case.
Well, and there's a duality there. There's, on the one hand, you have a person who is sacrificing and taking care of, and who genuinely loves his family. There's glimmers there. He does things to, at least in his own mind, protect the family, to take care of them. He would never leave Peg. He would never run off, even if later seasons make jokes about it, as you mentioned. And at the same time, he's miserable. And so it's almost like he projects that misery on everyone around him. But That's and weirdly enough, and I think this is also a credit to the writing because it is so funny, but it is never really shown as harmful. It's never really shown as him being ostracized by anyone around him. The family always there. The neighbors always come back. There are jokes about the neighbors who we don't see who hate him, but in general, because everyone is sniping, because everyone is just walking into the room and delivering sick burns, to paraphrase another podcast, no comment, but because that exists, you don't. It's almost as though it's an alternate world, and that's just the world that he lives in. But it is very familiar, because I almost feel like on some level, as negative as the show portrays Al Bundy's life, I feel like a lot of people wish they could be like and or see themselves as Al Bundy.
Right, I think that's fair to say, and I feel to a point that we've painted a certain picture of him, but we've kind of left out things you do see throughout the show, like the moments he does enjoy his family and whatnot. Like one episode that has stuck in my mind over this long time is maybe you've seen it, where they do this kind of supermarket game show.
I know the one you're talking about, but recap it because you probably remember better than I do.
Well, if I can remember it all that well, like for those who might not know, back in the '90s and late '80s, there was this game show that was kind of it was in like a supermarket, like a grocery store or whatever, and there was a bunch of challenges, questions.
This used to be on TV a lot actually. In the '90s, the sweepstakes or you get a 20-minute shopping spree to grab anything you want in the store off the shelves. Toys R Us did this. I remember Cartoon Network had a Toys R Us one where you can grab anything you want off the shelves in 10 minutes or something.
Oh yeah. I think I remember hearing about that. But yeah, there was it was something that it lasted a few seasons. I'm not exactly sure how popular it was, but Married with Children did an episode kind of either parroting it. I'm not sure if they directly referenced the show, but it was some local market thing they did, and it's one of those weird episodes that, like most episodes of Married with Children, the family want nothing to do with each other in that fun, cheeky, snarky way. But it's one of the few episodes that you see them having to work together, and them like it's funny because the funny thing about Married with Children is as soon as they're against another family, they're the most cooperative family in the world, and that's one of the most hilarious things about the show is that they hate normal people so much that they will put their differences aside, and like they'll trash someone else in a competition or whatever. They work together all the time.
There's a couple episodes I do remember. I'm going to give you one of the lines, and this is one of my favorite lines in the show that I always tell people, and it is yet to not get a laugh. Al Bundy opens the door in the morning to get the newspaper or something, and there's a little kid standing there. And he says, "What do you want?" And he says, "Are you Al Bundy?" And he says, "Who's asking?" He says, "Well, my dad says my dad says that you eat dirt and rocks, or dirt and bugs or something." And then Al looks at him and says, "Well, you tell your daddy that you have the mailman's eyes."
Oh yeah, see that's always the kind of stuff that you would hear just quickly thrown out there.
If you say that in real life, you're gonna get punched.
Right, absolutely. And it's such an odd show because it managed able to get away with so much, and yet I don't think many people find it too problematic, at least from like the corners of the internet I've been in.
Well,
Married
and
with Children.
We should stress for the record also that, in a weird way, as much as Al Bundy represents the typical put-upon blue-collar male, you could not be Al Bundy in real life. You would lose
absolutely.
your job. You'd probably go to jail.
Yeah.
But he can say things, and he can get away with things that a viewer cannot. And I'm actually now wondering if that's part of the appeal. Like, don't say anything specific, but we have both worked in some kind of blue-collar job in the past, especially dealing with customers.
Right.
Now, I remember another specific scene where there is a woman who is trying on shoes, and these are always the best jokes. But she's trying on shoes, and she says, "No, that's not the right color. I want a different shade of blue." And he looks at her, he's got that look of like, ah. And he says, "Okay, here's what we'll do.
Right.
I am going to begin strangling you. When you turn the color of blue that you want, you yell moo and I'll stop." Now, I'm not saying that I would ever say this to someone in my line of work. With that said, if I could get away with it, I'm not saying I wouldn't.
Absolutely. Now, here's the thing. Like, I feel to a point, Al Bundy is the kind of character that people have done not before, but have done since, and has generally failed miserably. Now, we mentioned Ed O'Neill, but what do you think makes Al Bundy so successful where other sitcoms try to do a character like this and it doesn't succeed?
I've already mentioned the writing, so I'm going to go on a slightly different tack. One of the things that Married with Children has, especially in concerns to Al, is that it is this very, very fine line, very thin, between total fantasy and realism. That there is some relatability there, but at the same time, Al is able to, and remember, good writing, but he is able to tell jokes and insult people to their face that would annoy the people that the show is appealing to. He is able to sit down on the couch and complain about his life, and to abuse a cliche, he's saying what we're all thinking.
Right.
And so, the reason I think Al Bundy would succeed where a different character might fail, and that's not to suggest that there wasn't anyone like Al Bundy, but he really is in this bubble of, it's almost this perfect storm of negativity, sarcasm, pessimism, cynicism, mixed in with nobility, caring, and an actually not that awful moral compass. Again, you mentioned it. The show will make jokes. He'll go to the club. He will make that. What was the club called? What,
I am spacing out on that. I don't quite
Men
remember.
Against. I'm forgetting it.
Oh,
No, it's
yeah,
the No
yeah.
Mans. I forget
Yeah,
what it
No
stands
Mans.
for, but he makes the No Women Club, and then he goes and they have meetings at a strip club. And this is what I'm talking about. He does boorish things. He does selfish things. He will. It would not be out of character to show like a school playground, and then Al Bundy is in the bushes, and then when the kids are there, he runs out, grabs their lunch boxes, and runs away. So that's what I think is most interesting about this character, is that he can occupy both ends of that spectrum depending on what the scene calls for, and it never becomes unbelievable based on the character. I can see him doing something horrible but still very funny, or I can see him doing something very noble and still very funny.
Right. And to give more of an example of what I mean by characters that try to be him, and I think I'll go into my own example of why I think he works versus other characters. In a sense, Tim Allen has played a few.
You're thinking about Home Improvement, right?
Well, partially Home Improvement, which is a little bit more excusable, but I'm more thinking that terrible, and I'm going to be mean right now, that terrible fucking sitcom Last Man Standing.
I did not see it.
It would be on at my work, and so I'd catch glimpses of episodes and whatnot.
Oh man, I got Roseanne at my work.
Oh, lucky. But basically, here's the difference. I think Al Bundy, they're aware that he's not a good person. And the show, in its writing, being completely aware, even the audience can be aware of that and still like him. Where you watch something like Last Man Standing, where he's just complaining about millennials and all that kind of stuff, it comes off like he's absolutely supposed to be the hero, and he's supposed to be the right guy all the time, and it makes it very distasteful. Where Al Bundy, he can say all this, he could say stuff about millennials. He never did because that wasn't really a term during the show's run, but he could say that stuff, and because of how he's framed, um, we just laugh because, oh, that's Al Bundy. That's he's kind of a snake in the grass or whatever, but that's the point. And it's funny that way because, and I think, um, to a point, the only other character I've ever seen do the Al Bundy thing and still be successful is William H. Macy's character in Shameless, if you've seen that.
I don't think so. I'm much more 90s sitcoms. Whenever I try and watch one in the 2000s, I just give a long sigh and then I pass out because I've been sighing for too long.
That's fair, because a lot of modern sitcoms are very hard to watch. Though it's more of a Shameless. I would actually highly recommend. It's kind of rough, and it's very much blunt with its framing, but it's a very good. It's a dramedy kind of sitcom. I wouldn't even. It's a sitcom by definition, but it's not the setup or the production styling of a regular sitcom. It's much more prestigious show kind of styling to it,
Mm.
but it's worth the watch. But my point is that William H. Macy's character is probably, I'm spacing on his name, Frank. There it is. His character is is probably the only other time I've seen someone who's strictly a lot like Al Bundy's character work, where he's obvious, he's terrible, and he's probably even worse and more irredeemable than Al Bundy's character, but he's so enjoyable because well, one, it's William H. Macy, and he is fantastic. I love him, but it's one of those things that it's so rare to see a character done so well. Where most of the time, I think they try too hard to make him the lovable hero in this room full of idiots, and so it becomes distasteful. Where Al Bundy, he is the idiot in the room, and so he's lovable that way.
And the other thing also about Al specifically, you mentioned earlier All in the Family that Archie, Carol O'Connor's character, he is against the new generation. He's got this mindset of, oh, I don't like these newfangled liberal ideals. Can't we just go back to the good old days? And
Right,
to be fair, they show there's a side there. It's very clear that Archie does not like the following things, whereas Meathead and Gloria do, and Edith is kind of caught in the middle of it.
right.
Now, Al Bundy hates everything. He does not discriminate in his annoyance or hatred with the world. There are a few things that he likes. He likes women, he likes beer, he likes money,
And he likes football.
he likes football. In fact, I remember a scene where he is going through a bunch of no, it's a bunch of petitions. And it's like, save the whales. He's like, go away. And they keep coming up and they're like, save the rainforest. No, thank you. And then a guy at the end is like, did you hear they're raising the beer tax 5 cents? He's like, what? This is crazy. And he jumps out and he starts going behind the table. He's like, we got to get signatures.
Jesus.
I
Oh,
love it.
man.
I love it because that's my point, though, is that Al does not discriminate in the fact that he dislikes everything. He is just this grumpy, sour, unflappable in his annoyance character, unless there's something specific. And almost weirdly enough, there's something about the way in which he really does love all these things that he does love. Like, he likes football, he likes pretty women, he likes, we mentioned it, but he really likes them. In fact,
Right.
one common plot point is Al wants to do something. Whether it's he wants to go to a strip club, or he wants to watch a football game, or maybe there's a bar giving away free drinks because they won the Super Bowl or something, and then the family or something around him will interfere to keep him from being able to do this.
Right.
Oh, we want you to judge a bikini contest. Oh, well, we can't do that because you need to. Oh, it turns out that Bud needs someone to bring him his homework at college. I'm just making something up, but and then
Right.
that's the plot of the episode. Is Al wants to do this thing, And he never gets to, for the record, almost never.
Right. And Ed O'Neill's facial expressions through the whole thing will always be hilarious. Even when he's not saying anything, his facial expressions will just leave your gut wrenching and just from laughter because he's so good. Just the eyes, the mouth. He's perfect. Again, I don't think anyone else could have played this part.
And let's also talk about one of the most famous parts of the show and what makes Al Bundy perhaps stand out as a character from pretty much any sitcom character that I can think of. One of the running gags slash plot points of the show is that Peg, his wife, always wants to have sex and he never wants to.
Yeah, you don't think about that much, but yeah, that is very much a recurring.
Like at least once per episode in some cases, and they make a joke about it. And it's not that he hates his wife; he loves his wife on the inside. He says he says he hates her. He says he hates her to her face.
Right.
But she will always be wanting to go to bed together, and he is never into it. And it's interesting because he loves pretty women. And don't get me wrong, Katie Sagal is a very attractive woman, and in fact, she is made up to be a very attractive woman in this show.
Right.
Very much almost exaggerated in the features and the walk and things, but with that said, she's not unattractive. But the running joke is that Al, who otherwise is this womanizing, almost sex-crazed guy, does not want to sleep with his own wife. And I'm curious, what do you think that says about the character versus something else? Because I cannot think of another sitcom character off the top of my head, a male character, I should say, who openly refuses sex whenever offered to him by his spouse. In fact, that's often how the episode ends, is they run upstairs and you hear the cat calls.
Right. Yeah, that is a fairly common ending to a sitcom episode, depending on the sitcom. But yeah, and I think it's a funny joke because there could be multiple things to it, but to a point, it's because he already has her, and he's like, it's not, quote unquote, it's not fun anymore. In the joke, and to a point, again, like you said, he still loves her, and even then, they still talk about that they've had sex, so it's never it's not that they don't ever have sex. It's just it's always funny in the moment when she offers. He's just like, I don't want to even do anything.
He's like, no, I'm too tired, or no, I'm not interested.
Right, and so it's kind of a funny thing that is very unusual, but it's a joke that a lot of people look over, but it's definitely a solid joke in the show. And the thing is, I think when you look at Married with Children, one of the most important things to think about is that this show, even from writers to audience, I think they're like saying, definitely do not take this seriously. Because like I could see this show being done today, and okay, so I feel like I should preface this show, even though I do love it, is somewhat dated in cultural climate terms, and I don't think that's a bad thing.
I would agree. Now, weirdly enough, with that said, and again, I don't know. I'd have to rewatch it again, but I do remember there was an episode with a gay couple that was handled very well.
I don't quite remember that episode. I probably will have to.
It might have been one of the later
that.
ones, but there are a lot of good lines. But there is a there's a gay couple, and the man is hitting on Peg, one of the two in the couple. At least, right. Or no, he's spending time with her, and then the other man thinks that he's cheating on him with Peg. Sorry if the pronouns are getting weird here. And so, some great lines, by the way. Your wife. So there's a scene is he opens the door, Al does, and then there's this guy standing there, and he says, "My husband is dating your wife." And Al looks at him and he says, "So let me get this straight. No offense.
That is, oh,
Your husband, your husband, is dating my wife." Oh goodness. And he says, "Well, I guess people get what they deserve. He's getting your wife. Well, let the punishment fit the crime." You see what I mean? And then it leads into Al is talking to the guy, and he ends up cooking dinner for Al. And then Al is so enamored by his cooking that he starts to think about, would it be worth it? And as sitcoms go, that's not a bad episode.
yeah, it definitely is.
Honestly,
Like, okay, so
it's
I,
not.
I
And
s-
it's not like Flowery. It's like a businessman.
right, and so I should probably restate. Like when I say uh, cultural climate, I think I don't I don't personally remember the show doing anything that would be considered in poor taste, even by nowadays standards. But it's something that I definitely think could only be made in like the late 80s to 90s. And I don't think it's a bad thing that it couldn't be made now, just because of how sensibilities and sense of humor
I
are
do think
different now.
there's a timelessness to it, and
Yeah,
what I mean by that is that, as you mentioned, some of the references might be dated. Some of the humor might need to be updated in terms of just the culture. But there's something relatable that doesn't age about this put upon protagonist who just wants to have these little pleasures in life that just keep getting taken away from him again and again. And yet at the same time, he keeps going. He never gives up. He still puts on his shoes and goes to that job that he hates to take care of this family that he doesn't that doesn't appreciate him. Also, he can just sit on the TV, put his hand in his pants, and just lay there and do nothing.
yeah, and I think the most impressive thing about this show is that tight wire act that it manages to do. Because it is impressive that it manages to balance all those things out, while like being able to the nobility, the crassness, the being able to sympathize with Al Bundy, but understanding perfectly well he deserves everything he gets, which makes it so the show again never becomes too bitter, because it's not that, oh, they're just punishing Al. He gets what he gets, and it's never too mean, but it's never it's absolutely fitting of the crime
Well, and kind
in
of
some cases.
to go back to the last Pedanticast when we talked about Ed and Eddie.
Right,
There's an interesting idea there in that the main character of the show, and I would argue Al is the main character.
right,
The main character of the show will often fail in their goal, but you almost don't. You feel not that much sympathy for them because their goal is usually something that is not necessarily morally good.
right. And something I meant to bring up in the Ed and Eddie episode, but it kind of just slipped my mind. For the longest time, I've had a hard time watching failure comedy. Like I do not like Meet the Parents. I
Mm.
don't in, I don't enjoy those comedies where there's a moment where the main character is going to do something wrong and it becomes this big thing. It makes me cringe, and I don't find it enjoyable. But when you talk about Ed and Eddie and Married with Children, for some reason it just works. It never makes me cringe or feel awkward watching it.
You know, and I'm gonna put a theory for you. Okay, so humor is largely about expectation, and
Right.
so it's all about what you imagine. So I'm gonna give you an example of this using Married with Children, and this is probably my favorite episode. So the setup is that Al and Jefferson, who is Marcy's second husband, want to install a satellite dish on top of the house.
Right.
And so they're sitting in the kitchen and they're talking about how Al is up on the roof with Jefferson right now. Now, what do you think is going to happen?
My thought process is that they're going to either fall off the roof or fall through the roof.
Now, you see that coming, but what you probably are not expecting is that Al, you hear his scream, "Wah!" And then he falls in the background. You see the sliding door, and he is now hanging upside down by his ankle, bouncing in the back, going, "Ah!" And then the characters react like, "Oh my!" They don't react with horror. Peggy just gives a sigh. And that's one of the joys of the show, by the way, is that whenever someone gets hurt, they play it off.
Right.
They do not ever treat physical violence as anything more than a part of life. Um, and weirdly enough, so you see, you can do this humor where you set up the predictable thing, but you still have to throw a twist in there. One of the jokes is that Al would always go downstairs and Kelly would be with a guy. And then Al would pick the guy up by his collar, walk him over to the door, slam him face first into the door, open it, and throw him outside.
Yeah.
But one of the joys is that they kept on doing variations of that. That wouldn't work if they did it 50 times.
Right.
But it's like, oh, she's with a pizza guy, and Al picks him up, and he's like, hey, I'm just trying to get a tip, and he's like, oh, okay, I got a tip for you. Bang! He throws him out there, and you know it's coming, and you almost are like, you're looking forward to it.
Right. It's enjoyable. Not catchpatchphrase per se, but
It's a running gag. And by the way,
right,
this show
running
does
gag,
have a
that's
lot
the
of
word
running
I was looking
gags.
for. Yeah. Out of the damn near the 10 years it existed 263 episodes. There were plenty of running gags. Now, something I want to talk about is, so we've talked a lot about the show, and we've mentioned some influences it had on the sitcom genre. I kind of want to talk about how far this influence has really gone,
Mm-hmm.
and maybe in some places how it hasn't really survived. In the sense, like, okay, so when the show came out, there wasn't many crass sitcoms like it.
No, it was
like,
controversial. It was.
Yeah. But when it came out, after it came out, you started to see a lot more. Like Roseanne, like came out 2 years later. There was like that '70s show. I don't think would exist without it, because it's kind of a similar snarky sense of humor. There was just a lot it managed to change with sitcoms, which
Influence,
sitcoms.
I would say, rather than change, but
Yeah, and choice of words. But the the thing is, though, we I mentioned those sitcoms, but I feel even though it was such a powerful force through sitcoms, for some reason, um, the lessons of that sitcom was not learned by the industry as a whole. And like you say, how you can't watch sitcoms now, and I kind of want to talk about that because it seems like I don't want to give the wrong impression, but it seems like they're kind of going back to safe humor, I guess, like where sitcoms for a little while were becoming somewhat edgy and somewhat a good place to talk about subjects in a laughing manner. Like if you had a hard subject, you could do it, like on Married with Children, or even Roseanne. They had one where it's like they talked about marijuana, and they've talked about a lot of issues on Roseanne.
I feel like if they're going to do that, though, Roseanne would be much more treating it with some kind of dignity, whereas Married with Children would be much more farcical.
Right, and there's those two sides, but I feel like nowadays you watch a lot of sitcoms and they become safe and they've become pandering again, and we've kind of dipped down into a little bit. Like there was some good ones, like whether you agree with how it ended or not. How I Met Your Mother was another one that managed to do certain topics really well. Well, not others,
Mm-hmm.
but they managed to do where they brought up some interesting topics and they're able to explore them fairly well and with some fair maturity. Even Frasier, I'd say, even though it was kind of on the safer side, it managed to do some very interesting topics well. But I feel like when you talk about like,
I gotta whip a fastball at you here.
all right,
Okay, so I get what you're going at, but I do want to ask. There's a key word here with Married with Children, and I think that word is likability. I feel like there's not a main character, Married with Children, who I do not like, who I don't look forward to seeing in an episode. But even with something like How I Met Your Mother, odds are there's a character that you don't like. For a lot of people, it's Ted.
right,
Um, if you have something like Big Bang Theory, there's a character who annoys you. There's a character who frustrates you. If you talk about what else?
The King of Queens.
King of Queens. Once again, you might get frustrated with certain characters, or you might say this humor, like the character is getting upset about something and or overreacting to something, and it doesn't feel justified, it doesn't feel earned, or it feels like overly heavy-handed.
Right.
And I really think that the strength of Married with Children is that even though it is a farce, even though it is really over the top, tongue in cheek. If you look at the images I picked, which is Al pretending to hang himself, Al talking about waking up in bed next to a giant foot, all these things. But as much as it is this very much cartoon exaggeration of real life, at the same time, you do find yourself either relating to or sympathizing with or wanting these characters, horrible people though they may be, to succeed in their goals just because they are likable. And I do wonder if that's one of, it's almost like they're skipping that crucial step in a lot of these sitcoms where they say, oh look, what was that William Shatner one that came out?
That put me on the spot with William Shatner. I know
It's
the
like
one you're
stuff my
talking
dad
about.
says.
Oh yeah. I know.
But
What
it's
you're
like,
talking. I
look,
can't
we're
think of
being
it.
controversial. We're showing, we're talking about issues. We're doing these things. And I'm like, you have to earn that. You have to make me like your characters. You have to make me laugh at mundane situations. You can't just jump straight into controversy head first.
Right, and I feel like a lot of times with those sitcoms, a problem I have with a lot of those sitcoms, it feels like I'm listening to the writer more than I am listening to the characters, if that makes sense. Like the writer's commenting on it, and I don't feel like that's the character at all. It's more of a avatar.
That is another thing, actually, is that in addition to likability, these characters in Married with Children also feel very human.
Yeah,
They feel like people. Cartoon characters, though they may be, they feel like people. They feel like people who I might know, maybe not hang around with, but who I might know of, or in my actual life or would encounter in real life. And not to pick on it, but Big Bang Theory, one of the most popular sitcoms of the past 20 years, they don't feel
yep.
like people. They feel like robots. You know that scene in Futurama where the robot is just like programmed to say whatever the most popular thing is at any given time?
Yeah.
That's what Big Bang Theory feels like to me sometimes.
Oh yeah, I feel like we could have an episode on Big Bang, but it would be very mean-spirited.
You would have to tie me to a chair to get me to behave in that episode.
I think I'd be the same way. So maybe we could make a pact now, not to do an episode about Big Bang Theory.
Unless you want it, whoever's listening.
Yeah, if the audience
If the
really
petition
demands
gets 50 signatures.
it.
Moving on.
Right.
So, all in all, I want to get back to that question. Al Bundy, is he a hero or an anti-hero? Because he has negative qualities. He is selfish, philandering, possibly drunken. He is all about just whatever his satisfaction is, whatever he can get. And he's miserable and negative and mean-spirited to just about everyone around him. But he's a good guy at heart. He's got the heart of gold, again, to abuse a cliche. He still loves his family, even though he wouldn't tell them that. He still wants to support them, and he still does. He believes that this is just what he is supposed to do. That as a man, it is his job to provide for his family, even if it's something that he hates. And so that comes down to, is it hero or anti-hero in that case? Is he someone who is heroic because of his few good qualities, or who is not heroic because of the overwhelming negative qualities?
Oh, here's how I'll put it. When you think about the writers and what they were probably thinking, Al is not so much a hero as an anti-hero. But when you think about people and just how they are, people like to relate to someone who is not even so much his noble qualities that people like to relate to. There's a sense in people that like to relate to negative qualities, and I think it's because they resent the system that they are in. And to a point, I think that's what makes Al Bundy a hero, because it's not so much about how bad Al Bundy is or how bad his family is. It's that the quote unquote system they're in, them being lower class and having to kind of slave away his job is kind of is bad, and so he's resentful of it, and the people are resentful of it when they're watching the show, and so he becomes this sort of heroic beacon. It's kind of hard for me to put specifically, because to me, I would still qualify him as an anti-hero, but he's the anti-hero in all of us, I'd say.
That is beautifully put. And I want to just add one final point on this question of hero or anti-hero to say that I think in the writer's mind, there's one of two goals they had when conceiving of this character. The first would be that he is likable because you can see him suffering and feel better about your own life. Like
Right.
you almost say, I'm glad I'm not this guy. Or the other thing is that see it as you see it as an over-the-top satire of what real life is like. And so I think that at some point, possibly between script to performance, somewhere in there, it moves away from the satire of the American life to more, again, relatable, to this very relatable idea. Maybe you don't have a job as bad as Al Bundy, but maybe you are in a job that you don't like, or maybe that you, this is going to sound horrible, but maybe you are in a marriage that is not easy to maintain. And so maybe in that way, Al Bundy, to the horror of the people creating him, can kind of serve as that role model, because if, again, going by the philosophy is you don't have to like everything. You don't have to be happy with what you're given. It's okay to feel angry. It's okay to feel resentful, but don't forget that even in this horrible scenario, even with this terrible job that he's in, even with this family who doesn't appreciate him, who makes fun of him, and who actively works against his happiness, that there is still joy to be found, that there is still some happiness, fleeting though it may be.
Absolutely, I would totally agree with you on that one.
So, so kind of about want to wind up now. Looking at Al Bundy as a character, I think that really Married with Children is just, it's about him pretty much. I would say that he is the main character, he's the main focus, and that more than anything, he is the main reason to watch the show. I do not think that you can have the show without him. And I think that popularity is very well earned. But I do also think that, with that said, I do wonder how much of that is between the script versus the performance. How much of it was planned and how much of it was adapted after either Ed O'Neill's performance or just the audience reaction.
Well, and I think there's something to be said about how well an actor and a writer connects. Like I mentioned that audition earlier, and I think that represents, like, when there's a point where I would say actors can save a script, or when a script does not necessarily that it's good, but an actor does not quite hit the nails. Like Rules of Engagement is one I know, and I'll be quick about this, that I watched that show, and the show itself, in my personal opinion, and all these things being said are our personal opinions. If you don't agree with them, you're not a bad person or anything. But in my personal opinion, Rules of Engagement is not a good show. It's not very funny, but you got a cast that somehow manages to make it work, or they manage to deliver the lines to make it better. With Married with Children, the writers and the actors seem to be on the same wavelength, at least for most of it, and so that translation there, I think, is a lot of it. The cooperation, and we talk about Al Bundy. Ed O'Neill does a fantastic job, but also couldn't be done. Even though we say it couldn't be done without Ed O'Neill or Al Bundy's character, couldn't be done without Katie Seagal and Christina Applegate and
The writers. David
yeah,
Faustino, by the way.
yeah. I keep forgetting his name.
He's
And
gonna comment on this now. You know that. I'm gonna tweet it to
yeah,
him.
right. Um, but they too make it such an enjoyable show because if it was just Al Bundy, it would be one thing and maybe still enjoyable, but the cast and how the other parts of the cast and how they do their job make Al that much better.
That's all fair, and I really, and I kind of just want to wrap up by saying that whenever the subjects for Pedanticast are usually those stuff that just sticks in our memories, and
Right.
Al Bundy really does stick in my head whenever I think of like just sitcoms in general. It's hard not to overlook him because I really do feel like I don't know if we're gonna have another character that hits all of those notes quite the way that he does in this show. It is almost lightning in a bottle to find a character who is almost unanimously loved, applauded whenever he goes on screen, who gets these just visceral but very genuine reactions from the audience in there and also from the audience at home. And I think that if anyone is ever interested in watching, I would give it a solid recommendation for the show in general. The writing is very good. It's very funny. It is from the '90s, so make sure that grain of salt in terms of the culture and values. But with that said, I'd recommend it. And that's pretty much what I want to say. Is that I have nothing but praise for Al Bundy, and I'm just fascinated how you have such a oddly complex character that should be so simple.
Absolutely. I think that is definitely the anomaly of Al Bundy is that he seems like he should be such a simple character, but when you really start picking it apart, there's a lot of layers to it.
And on that note, that will basically wrap up the Pedanticast for this week. We don't really have a particular subject in mind for next week, but I do want to say that we like varied subjects. So it might be TV, it might be movies, it might be animation, it might be video games. We'll see. In the meantime, though, I remind everyone to be pedantic. Clark, anything you'd like to say before we head out?
My question is that going to be our catchphrase now?
A catchphrase a week. That's the Pedanticast promise.
Yeah, we'll think of something new next week to say. We'll see what sticks. We'll throw it against the wall. Hopefully it splats.
I'll throw you against the wall. On that note, we'll see you next time, guys.
All right. Thanks for listening.
Peace and love. Don't do anything we wouldn't. See ya.
See you.